I'm Roy Rapoport. I work for Netflix. I have the stock, Culture and the Games People Play. And I want to actually start with a little game. It's worth noting, in case people are wondering, I actually asked for 2 volunteers to do this. And Terrence and Sarah didn't quite volunteer, but we're certainly willing to do this. So let's imagine I've hired Sarah and Terrence to do a job. And the job I would like you to do is actually to just hold on to this lovely little power bank that QCon has given us. Great job. You're doing great. Your 360s are going to be, stellar. So here's the fun part. I'm going to give you some time. And the first of you who decides to let go of the power bank and raise their hands, I'm going to give you I believe a $20 Netflix gift card that I bought at 7-Eleven 2 nights ago. And I'll give you like 10 seconds to decide. Again, it's the first person goes, but maybe neither of you will select it. And at the end of the 10 seconds, if neither of you does this, I'll just hold on to the Netflix gift card because, I can use the money. Okay, go. 4 seconds. 3, 2, 1. Okay, great. Perfect. Can I?
The baby in half.
Yeah. Woo! Gift card. So here's the interesting thing, right? I, quote, hired Terrence and Sarah to do a given job, and then I made their job harder by giving them an incentive to do something that is actually explicitly not their job. And while thankfully, because I'm actually interested in them holding on to that power bank, they actually held on to the power bank. Feel free to put the bag down, by the way. It's just my bag. So thankfully, they decided to do the right thing from the perspective of me, the employer, but they had to really think about it. I made this far more complicated for them than it could have been. And that's really the story of today's presentation. Because here's the thing, right? Every organization I've ever been in is interested in some sort of outcome. Your company may be interested in making more money. I hear that's a good thing. Or having more customers, or maybe having a fantastic product. It's all of these things that we would like actually as an organization to have happen. And the way you end up having that happen is by actions taken by people on the ground. And when I say people on the ground, I mean people at all levels of the organization. Fundamentally, you're not going to get an outcome without people doing something about it. And the way people decide on those actions is they make some decisions. I'm going to take this action. I'm not going to take that action. And the most interesting part of this for me is how do people decide what actions to take? What are the inputs for people's decisions? And there are 2 big categories of inputs for that I've found. One is the statements by the organization. What does the organization tell you it would like you to do? Has anybody here ever worked for an organization that said that they would really like their employees to be collaborative? Oh, wow, that's a lot. And has anybody here ever worked for an organization that said it expected and hoped that its employees would be innovative? Yeah, okay, good. So, engineering. And that's great. And then the other interesting input to this is what the organization actually does to create the structures and incentives in place to encourage you to do what they would like you to actually do and to encourage you to do what they tell you to do. I'm really actually interested in that because it turns out that all of this stuff has to be relatively well aligned. My white arrows here are a little hard to see, but if you want your outcome gear to be going clockwise, then your action gear actually has to go sort of counterclockwise, and et cetera. So all of these things have to be aligned. And the thing is, if you focus on the decisions and the input from the organization of what the organization says it'd like you to do, and then what the organization does to encourage behavior, that can create some interesting and hilarious problems. And what you end up when these things are not aligned is you go from an employee who's really clear about their job and what's important to an employee who's pretty confused, who's lost a few teeth as part of this process, and who's probably not being nearly as effective as, or happy, frankly, as you would like them to be. So, generally speaking, are most people here related to engineering? Okay, good. So we all love testing, I know. And throughout this, I'm going to actually do a few sort of little mini tests. These are all basically horror stories that I heard from colleagues and coworkers when I started soliciting them, getting ready for this presentation. And the way we're going to do this is I'm going to tell you about an actual company. I'm going to keep it anonymous. And if you know the name of the company, don't blurt it out, please. Let's be kind. Who had an interest in driving employee behavior in a certain way and created an incentive structure. And I'm going to ask you how you would possibly use rational thought in your best interest to get the best benefits from this incentive structure while not necessarily acting in the way the company hopes you're going to act. We'll test this out. We'll see how it works. I've never done this before. So, first one. I have a friend who worked at a company where the founders were actually really interested in productivity. So because they're interested in productivity and they saw productivity as essentially being related to the hours you work, they created an incentive structure where basically the number of hours you spent in the office was pretty much directly related to how likely you were to get promoted, how likely you were to get pay raises. And it wasn't just the number of hours you spent in the office, it was also, frankly, the times of the day that people might see emails from you. So, let me know if there's any clarifying statements that I can tell you about that. But how would you sort of win in that kind of environment? Okay, good. So I'm sorry, I didn't see your name tag. So Greg said I would send an email on delayed time. I'm a huge fan of Boomerang for Google Apps, so I can schedule emails. Mostly I do that so my engineers don't get emails from me at 2 o'clock in the morning, but great idea, totally works. And there was Jesse. Okay, good. So replying to emails instantaneously on your phone. On the back there, sir. Okay, good. So you would basically be in the office all the time. Yeah, okay, grunt job. See, engineers, thinking about this in an engineering way. And lastly, I'm going to ask you. So, automatically reply to every email with thanks, got it, I'm on it. I am working hard. Yes, fantastic. All of these are reasonably rational answers. The other one I would take is, I come to work and I don't really do much and I just surf Reddit all day. Okay, good. So let's talk about the outcomes and the way we think about how we would like people to operate within Netflix. We have a relatively well-defined culture. We have priorities that are well understood by every engineer. And the thing about priorities is they have to be relative. So our priorities are 1, innovation, 2, availability, 3, cost. Now, if you're part of a team that costs less money, for example, let's say you're running 100 instances of your servers, then cost may be less interesting to you. My team costs many millions of dollars for Netflix, so cost is relatively important for us, but it's still number 3 for us. Cost is number 3 for everybody. The way we get this done is by hiring really smart, really experienced people. So that means that we don't necessarily hire, for example, really smart interns or people straight out of college. We're looking for experience. And we get out of their way. We have a very, very strong anti-process bias. One minor example of that is purchases don't have signing authority. So if you're an engineer and you make a purchase request, there's nobody who's going to approve that purchase request, which is kind of an interesting thing to get used to. So what does this actually look like in practice? How do we motivate the kind of behavior we want? Let me give you a little story as an example of this. A long time ago, back in 2011, we had an interesting problem, and this problem actually had been haunting us for a few years, for as long as I've been at Netflix. We had dozens of SSL certificates. And the thing about SSL certificates is, hilariously, they expire. And when they expire, you end up having some interesting problems. Because, for example, you might have an SSL certificate that's responsible for the ability of Xbox users to stream Netflix. The best part of this is that we operate in Pacific Coast time. We're here in the Bay Area. But, of course, our machines operate in UTC time. So our certs would expire at 4 p.m. in the afternoon, which is, by the way, coincidentally, the start of rush time for Netflix. Yay! The other interesting problem that we had at the time, which was relatively new to us moving to Amazon, is that Amazon resources are sort of, infinitely scalable. This is, by the way, why I ended up doing research on the American Express card. And really, when we say infinitely scalable, it's more like we don't really have a preset limit. You could say that Amazon is infinitely scalable for suitably small values of infinite. And when we would run out of capacity, we would know about it in the most ugly way, which is you're trying to launch something and Amazon goes, nah, no, good luck with that. And again, this would typically happen as we would scale up to deal with rush hour. Typically, it would happen when we would scale up on Friday, because Friday was our busiest time. And that's also not really like a great time to discover this kind of stuff. So our ecosystem at the time was actually really well developed. If you were a developer at Netflix, you got a bunch of stuff just handed to you. You had service discovery libraries, so you didn't have to deal with that. You had database clients for Mongo and for Cassandra and SimpleDB. Credentials management, which I'll talk about in a second. Memcache, server infrastructure, so you don't have to write like an HTTP server or pick one from the myriad of ones available. And of course, a telemetry platform. And that was all great if you're a Java developer. The problem for me was, at the time, I had just moved over from IT to engineering. And I was asked as literally my first project in engineering as an individual contributor to solve this SSL certificate expiry problem. And then, because I ended up doing it relatively quickly, I got a new quarterly goal tacked on to deal with the Amazon thing, which was fun. I wouldn't say I'm a good Python developer. Nobody who's seen my code would say I'm a good Python developer. The most I could say is I'm reasonably effective, and I write pretty decent sort of proofs of concept that work for a while. But worse, I am not even smart enough to enjoy writing Java. And by the way, I'm guessing there are a few people here who are smart enough to enjoy Java, and my hat's off to you. I'm totally impressed. So the expectation, because we don't think of language knowledge as one of those things that's innate, we don't test for that, is, oh, you're moving from engineering, you're going to spend the first month or 2 or 3 learning Java. But the problem is I wasn't smart enough to enjoy that process. So what I ended up doing was I ported the necessary Java infrastructure libraries to Python, which made a lot of sense to me. I thought it was a way to sort of maintain velocity, and totally didn't make sense to my boss. I mean, has anybody here ever worked in an environment where you have like one language that everything is working on, and then some probably somewhat arrogant, confident person comes and says, we should use Go. Sorry, I didn't mean to pick on Go specifically. So yeah, so for about a month, every one-on-one I had with my boss, he'd be like, so Python, really? Are you sure you want to do that? Like, is that really the way you want to go forward? And I was like, yeah, I think it's going to work. We'll see how it happens. So that moved forward. I ported a bunch of libraries to Python, and then I ran into an interesting problem. We had this credentials management library, which basically is a library that would allow you to not store credentials for AWS on your machine. Not that it stopped developers from doing that, but they just didn't have to. And when I tried to port that library to Python, I ran into some problems because of the security stuff. It was doing SSL client validation stuff, which was a pain in the ass, which was a pain in the butt, which was a pain in the neck. With Python, at least back in 2011, and I ended up going to the engineer. His name is Jay, and he had written the service, and he had written the Java library. And I said, hey, Jay, listen, I know you don't have to because you already sort of discharged your responsibility by writing the Java library, but I'm trying to port this to Python, and I'm running into problems. And Jay said, oh, OK, that seems like an interesting and worthwhile problem to solve. And Jay dropped everything he was doing on the floor, and for the next 2 days, worked with me to port his library to Python. He was, by the way, not a Python developer, but a smart guy, and we made it work. Some things that are worth noting didn't happen. Jay didn't ask his manager for permission to work on this. I didn't go to Jay's boss and say, hey, can I have some time from Jay to make this happen? I didn't go to my boss to have my boss go to Jay's boss to get some time from Jay. By the way, does any of this sound familiar? Have you ever had to do this? And best of all, I didn't have to go to some sort of program management office and basically get this work prioritized. It just happened. Another example, a year or 2 after that, I was actually managing a team at Netflix, and I got an email from one of my people talking about what he's done over the last week, and it included this bullet item, proof of concept work on Ansible configuration management for Gulo and Hammerhead. Show of hands, how many people know what that means? Yeah, me neither. I mean, I know what Ansible is. We have typically not used Ansible at Netflix, but Gulo and Hammerhead, no idea. Well, it actually turned out that a reliability engineer at Netflix decided that it would be kind of an interesting idea to build a remote telemetry network using custom-built hardware that we would give ISPs and video-on-demand companies that they would put in their networks and would let us know what Netflix streaming looks like from that vantage point. That effort involved broad cross-functional participation from reliability engineering, inside engineering, performance engineering, a few others. And I only found out about it about 2 or 3 weeks after one of my engineers, who happens to be really good at Ansible, not the reason we hired him because we don't use Ansible normally, started working on this project and spending like 40% of his time on this project. This involved a cross-functional effort with no management buy-in, no management oversight, and no management control as to whether or not it's even the right idea. And the room is probably right now split between some people who are like, wow, that's pretty cool, and some people who are like, that's horrifying. By the way, I don't know that I can ask for a show of hands for who thinks that's, actually, let's see. Anybody here thinks that's potentially kind of horrifying and willing to raise their hands? Yeah, okay, good. Be proud, brothers. Wait, there's a Netflix manager who just raised his hands. We're going to have some words. So, how does this happen? How do you build a culture of collaboration and selflessness? Some of the things that we've tried to focus on are, one, we really want to avoid zero-sum games. Zero-sum games are also known as competition. We stamp out internal competition pretty hard. That obviously means we don't do stack ranking. I'm not going to ask if anybody in this room still believes that stack ranking is the way to go, because I suspect nobody's going to be willing to raise their hands. They're relatively unpopular at this point. Still used, but relatively unpopular. But it also means that we don't have fixed bonus or raise pools, for example. So we're not all competing for some sort of fixed resource. And we don't rank or quantify employees in any way. I can talk after this presentation about our performance review approach. It doesn't involve any numbers. In order to make reviews useful for people, because we do 360, so everybody's going to give you feedback if they're interested, we also very explicitly don't tie reviews and performance to compensation. So our review process, our formal review process, happens around April, and our compensation decisions happen around October. They're actually exactly 6 months apart, so as to best demonstrate that they have nothing to do with each other. And lastly, we focus on decentralizing collaboration, which basically means giving up control over what engineers are actually going to be working on, trying to set context for what's important, and aligning goals. And when I say aligning goals is an interesting and useful thing to do. Everybody's interested in it. The easiest, laziest way to get this done, in my opinion, is actually kind of similar to what Sarah talked about Nordstrom for people who were here at the previous conversation. Really align on one goal. This is it. Do this, you're going to be successful. Don't do that, you're not going to be successful. The rest of this is just a matter of interpretation. So, everybody ready for another quick test of the emergency terrible incentive system? I have a colleague who once worked for a company where the founders were deeply concerned about the fact that developers seemed to be pretty bad at coming to work at 9 o'clock in the morning. I sympathize. I have very few developers I work with who are actually at work at 9 o'clock in the morning. So they came up with an obvious solution to this, which is this company used a bonus structure, and they said, hey, listen, if you come in late, you're going to lose a bit of your bonus. No big deal. You come in at 9:01, you're going to lose a little bit of your bonus. Okay. One or two other sort of clarifying bits of data. If you come in at 9:10 or 9:30, you're going to lose exactly as much, by the way, as you would lose if you're a minute late. With that in mind, what behavior does this drive? Yeah. If Sergey said, if I'm late, I'm going to show up at 12. Yeah, you might be tempted to get a coffee now because it doesn't even matter. Or you might call in for a sick day because, that way you don't have any loss. Anybody else? You might as well not work what? Yeah, so the company is going to take away my bonus, so I'm not going to work as long. One of the things that my colleague noticed on the ground was you could be 2 minutes away from finishing something you were working on all day. But by gosh, at 5 p.m., you're out of there. Any other behavior that, yeah, over there. Work somewhere else. Yeah, so that's always an interesting and reasonable approach given the job market to perverse incentive structures. And Jesse, one more. Yeah, so actually that's an interesting thing. People have found that if you penalize people for the wrong behavior, they can actually feel better about doing the wrong behavior because they feel like they're already paying for it. Daycare centers that charge per minute late prices have actually seen that people are more late because, hey, it's okay, I'm paying for it. Okay, good. So that sucks. So let's say we're interested in decentralized innovation and autonomy and independence. How do we make this happen? And I think part of the way we make this happen is by being much more tolerant of failure. And by way of example, I want to talk about my frankly atrocious report card. And when I say this, I was an engineer working for a director in cloud solutions at Netflix for about 18 months before I got moved into a management position. During those 18 months, every quarter I would sit down with my boss and say, this is the problem I want to deal with this quarter, or maybe these are the 2 problems I want to deal with this quarter. I actually collected sort of how those projects ended up turning out. I worked on this thing called Security Monkey that was successful. Howler Monkey was successful. Exploit Monkey was a failure. By the way, you might be noticing a theme here. We're fond of simians. I got Python into production, and that was obviously successful. I did this thing called Service SLA Dashboard. It completely failed. Alert outsourcing, we moved everything to PagerDuty. That was fabulous. Alert response analytics fell on the ground. Alert Gateway was successful. Alerting GUI was successful. Latency Monkey adoption was kind of a fizzle. We got some useful work, but it never sort of took off the ground. Stateful alerting was a failure. And open application alerting was a failure. I score 50%. So, who here thinks that that is a tremendous and really sort of like, high performance success rate? You're very kind. So the truth is, the successes were long-lasting. So these things that I wrote that were successful are now owned by actual teams of engineers who do know how to code and have proven to be valuable from basically the first quarter that I was working on them. The failures were failures that probably cost us something on the order of about 2 to 4 weeks of my time. So relatively low cost of failure. But the way you're going to get more success, the way you get more goals is by having more shots on goal and by people being willing to take those shots and not be concerned that you're going to get penalized if not all of those shots go in. Or in fact, in my case, if not more than about half of these shots go in. The other thing about emphasizing autonomy is, well, you got to actually give engineers autonomy. To demonstrate this, I want to talk about, 2 years ago, we had Asgard, which was Netflix's cloud orchestration system. It's fully GUI-based. We actually just recently announced its retirement. But at the time, this was the system that everybody at Netflix used to do deployments in the cloud. It was GUI-driven. It's beautiful. It had a team responsible for it. And it had some design criteria that made it so it was very specific to a specific Amazon account. So if you wanted to deploy to multiple accounts, you would just take the same action in like 2 different places for 2 different accounts. The thing is, for Inside Engineering, my group, it wasn't really a great fit necessarily. We were running in every region. We were running in every account. And we had hundreds of clusters. We have bought into this whole microservice thing. You might have heard about it. All the cool kids are into it these days. Pretty big. And so at some point, I had an engineer, when we were looking at what we were going to do for a given quarter, come to me and say, hey, listen, this quarter, I'm going to spend 100% of my time building our own deployment system. I thought that was pretty dumb. In fact, I thought it was pretty stupid. I've had a conversation with him. I think like 6 months ago, I had a conversation with him, and I was like, back when you said you were going to do this, I thought that was pretty stupid. And he said, yeah, that was pretty obvious. So the thing is, this completely duplicated the functionality of Asgard. It gave us a customized fit. I wasn't sure exactly how much that was actually going to gain us. But the most important thing is I have this thing called the override bar, which is what are the conditions that have to be present in order for me to actually override an engineer? And I try to be really clear about that. And for me, the override bar requires 2 conditions to be true. 1, am I actually absolutely certain that this is the wrong thing to do? Listen, I have a lot of opinions. as anybody who's talked to me has figured out. And I have a lot of things that I believe, but I rarely actually know for a fact, without any hesitation, that I'm right. And when I do, that's important for the override bar. The other one is, let's say I am right. What's the possible harm of actually getting this done? In this case, I wasn't sure that I was right, that this was a stupid thing to do. And more importantly, if I was right, we'd have wasted one person's time over a quarter. I had about 9 people reporting to me. That's about 11% waste in that given quarter. That's actually, for me, that was an acceptable cost. So we did that. We accomplished exactly what we were hoping to accomplish. So we built this thing that's actually just beautiful. It's incredible. It makes our deployments much easier for the largest part of Netflix's ecosystem that is stateful and still deploys basically every few days. It improved our resiliency and velocity by a bunch, but it also had some interesting unpredictable effects that I completely failed to predict. One was a bunch of other teams were like, oh, hey, that's kind of nice. Can we use that? And as a result of that, my team suddenly became responsible for a deployment system, which was something that I basically demonstrate as, be careful what you ask for. And the other thing is, it ended up actually being really inspirational. So we announced open sourcing Spinnaker, our next generation orchestration system, on Monday. Spinnaker has design elements and actual ways it gets work done that were inspired by our own deployment system. And if we do our job right over the next year or two, we'll actually retire our own system in favor of using Spinnaker for my team as well. The other thing to encourage autonomy is this concept of directly responsible individual. I'm assuming, by the way, not everybody here has heard of the concept of directly responsible individuals. Has anybody not heard of DRI? Okay, good, so a few. So here's the idea about DRI. DRI basically says that for every given decision, there is one, not less, not more, but one person who's responsible for the decision. And that means that nobody else is responsible for the decision. This contrasts with the way I've seen work in most companies go, which is, I have an engineer named Fong. She's a pretty great engineer. And there's a sphere of autonomy in which Fong gets to make decisions, right? Like I don't tell her how to code stuff. That would be laughable anyway. And the thing is, my sphere of autonomy in most organizations overlaps with Fong's. I get to basically deal with the decisions in Fong's area and a bunch of other areas. For example, all of the individual spheres of autonomy for the people in my team, but also my team overall. And of course, I report to Josh Evans. If any of you were in his presentation on Monday, he was very kind about that. And so Josh's sphere of autonomy overlaps with mine. It's a superset of my sphere of autonomy. I can make decisions. He can make decisions that overrule me. Josh works for Yuri. Yuri works for Neil. And finally, we have the Reed Hastings, the CEO, sphere of autonomy for the company. And this is how you get into situations where, for example, the CEO of the company tells you, no, I don't like you using this technology. I would like you to use this other technology, which I'm not going to ask anybody here to raise their hand if they've ever seen that happen, because you might be dealing with coworkers here. So what's the other approach? Well, imagine, going back to Fong, that she has a sphere of autonomy where she makes decisions. And I, of course, have my own sphere of autonomy, and the two have no overlap. Here's the thing. If Fong is responsible for making decisions about her product, for example, I am not responsible for making those decisions. Going up the line, that means that Josh doesn't get to tell me, what my team should be doing. He can provide, he has opinions. He has almost as many opinions as I do. But those are opinions, those are inputs, and I can listen to them, and I probably should, and then I'm going to do whatever the heck I'm going to do. This goes up the line. And those red lines are really important. It takes effort to maintain the separation between these spheres of autonomy, because every once in a while, somebody's going to want them to bleed over. In my experience, they actually happen about the same rate going down as they do going up. So every once in a while, I have, for example, a manager reporting to me. This is what makes managing managers for me a little more difficult than engineers. Engineers are pretty used to not asking me what they should do. Managers are a different thing. So managers sometimes ask me, hey, what do you think I should do? And I'm like, well, it's your decision. I can give you my opinion, but I want to be clear here. You're the only one who's going to make this decision. And in the other direction, every once in a while, less often, somebody from above me says, hey, I'd like you to do it this way. And I go, that's awesome. Thanks for letting me know. And I move on. In order for this to work, I was talking to one of my managers, and she asked me, so how is this different from chaos? And that's a worthwhile question. I think for me, the thing that makes us different from chaos is that if you set context for what's important, then people will make the right decision for what in their sphere of autonomy they need to be dealing with. That makes all the difference in the world, I think. The other thing that I really love about DRI, by the way, is that it's not just for dealing with managers. Sorry? This is what happens when you have latency. Can I go back to? Yeah. So it's not just dealing with managers. Here's another example. I have some engineers in my organization who are more outspoken and loud than others. Anybody had to deal with that before? Yeah. So, but every engineer actually owns their product, right? Has their own sphere of autonomy, and it's very clear. So a customer had asked us in the email to implement 1 or 2 features. And 2 of my louder engineers said, oh my God, that's a terrible idea. We shouldn't do that. You know, customers using the product wrong. Yeah, I have those engineers. And we shouldn't do that because that's the wrong approach. The product and the decision was owned by one of my quieter engineers, actually Fong earlier. And Fong was like, oh, okay, thanks for your input, guys. Like, super nice, didn't fight about it, didn't argue about it. And I left that conversation because I actually thought that feature was kind of useful. And in my next one-on-one with Fong, I sat down and I said, you know, that feature that customer asked for, it might actually be kind of useful. What do you think about it? I'd love for you to actually consider whether or not that's something you want to implement. And her answer was, oh yeah, I thought that was a good idea from the beginning. I implemented it, it's in production, I talked to the customer, he's happy. And by the way, one of the nice things about everybody knowing this whole DRI thing is that those engineers who had an opinion, as soon as she made a decision, were done. They weren't going to go back and say, no, that was the wrong decision. They had an opinion, they expressed it, but once the decision is made by the directly responsible individual, everybody respects that because everybody's clear that those spheres of autonomy don't bleed over. Ready for another test? So, you join a company because they think you're fantastic. And as your first project, true story again, they ask you to look at this big strategic problem they've got and figure out strategically what technology they're going to use, let's say it's for streaming analytics or whatever, to solve that problem. We trust you. We hired you because you're smart. And you work, let's say, a month or 2 talking to stakeholders about what they want and what they need. You look at technologies. You bring them in for proofs of concept. You're pretty comfortable with your decision. You say, hey, listen, we're going to go this way. And your manager goes, meh, I don't actually like that technology, so we're going to go this other completely different direction. So this happens to you. How does this affect your behavior? Anybody? Okay, so you stop making suggestions. At minimum, you're probably going to be a lot more careful and timid about making sort of decisions. Okay, good. You never put any effort in the future for making these sort of decisions because, gosh, that was a complete waste of your time and kind of totally demoralizing. Leopold? Ask for forgiveness rather than permission. Yeah, so that's the other approach. You just do whatever the heck you're going to do anyway. And I'm sorry? You lose interest in the project. And Jessica, last one.
Implement it really badly and the boss has chosen technology so it doesn't work and then you'll be right.
Ah, yes. This is known as the SYB technique. Have you heard of SYB? Stands for screw you, buddy. So there's pretty much like literally no downside to this except for all the downsides. This is my slide about the unicorn apocalypse. It is a unicorn vomiting rainbows and cuteness, and it says, we'll kill you with all the rainbows. So a few problems with this: predictability, locality, duplication, and duplication. So agility and predictability are kind of trade-offs. You can try to predict things, but that actually, I would argue, makes you less agile. And I would say that neither of these things is bad. You probably need some sort of balance of both. But it's important to be thoughtful about where you need to optimize. Depending on your business, you're going to be on different sides of this spectrum. And then figure out whether or not you have it and where you need to be going with this. For us, we optimize for agility. There was a little thing that was supposed to happen there, but okay. And we constrain predictability to the minimum that we can get away with. Some things we have to be predictable on. We're a public company, so public KPIs are important. We buy billions of dollars of content for launches in other countries, for example, and those dates are set in stone. But very many fewer things that I've seen need to be predictable than most companies actually go for. I worked in a company once where one of the things I had to do on a weekly basis is figure out for every single engineer in my team, 6 months in advance, how many hours they were going to spend in a given week on any one of the things that we were going to have to be responsible for 6 months in advance. A, it doesn't matter. B, you're not going to get it right anyway. The other interesting thing about making this happen is that if you can actually build something in one place, you can build something in the wrong place. And that results in wasted effort. As an example of this, I present Scryer. Scryer wanted to basically take our telemetry system, which gives you time series data, and create some sort of predicted signal for what that data should actually look like, so you can compare it with what you've actually got. So really, you've got this thing called a predictor that would take the data and come up with predictions. That's pretty simple. The predictions are the product. The predictor is the value add process. But in order to do that, our telemetry system only gave you online access to 2 weeks of data. The team who built this ended up having to build, first of all, a telemetry persistence database to hold 4 weeks of data, because they needed 4 weeks rather than 2 weeks to make good predictions. And then they needed to build an extractor to get data from our 2-week repository into the 4-week repository. The extractor was kind of a waste of time. The database was more annoying than that. And that happened because they didn't know something, which is that basically all of our data is actually kept in cloud storage. And we already had an ETL process to get any data from the cloud storage and pushed into the real-time system. Which basically meant that when we said, oh, hey, you know what, we can do this better, what we came up with was much simpler, which was they continue to maintain the predictor, which has a REST interface, and we just made the ETL system, get the data that they're interested in, push it into the predictor, and then get that directly into the system. Much more efficient, much cleaner, and they had to pay some cost in inefficiency. So, last test. You work for a very large engineering organization. Let's say you've got thousands of engineers, and they really want to encourage engineers to recognize and reward each other. So there's a spot bonus system where if an engineer does something really great and another engineer is really happy about that, like, wow, Jessica, I love your work on foo, they can say, hey, here's $100. Like, engineers can authorize $100 spot bonuses. The interesting catch, however, is that you can only get one $100 spot bonus for anything that you do. So if you've got 1,000 engineers who are like, holy cow, you've changed our lives, and submit $100 spot bonuses, the first one will go through, here's $100, and the rest of these are just going to laugh in your face. So how does this make an impact on your motivations if you're looking at what to work on that's going to make an impact? Anyone? Yeah, so you basically go for like minimum impact, because then you can do multiple projects, each of which, ideally has one person who wants to give you a bonus. Anything more than that is essentially waste. So you're going to forego the big bang projects, because, what's the point? Any other? It's probably actually the most obvious one from this. Okay, good. So somebody asked me yesterday, what are you most excited about, and what are you most worried about for this presentation? And what I said was, I have seen way too many presentations where people stand up and basically go, hey, here's my Ferrari. Isn't it a nice Ferrari? Don't you wish you had a Ferrari? Don't you feel bad that you don't have one? In this case, what that would look like is people sitting over here and thinking that what I just talked about is not all that relevant to them because they work in a company that doesn't have these cultural values, doesn't talk about this, and there's probably not much we can do about this. Hey, it's nice to be at Netflix. I don't actually believe that. I talked about sphere of autonomy, but there's another concept, which is the sphere of influence. Every single person in this room has some ability to influence people in their own workplace. I don't care if you're an engineer, or if you're a manager and therefore get listened to less, or a director, or a VP. There are people in your organization who are going to listen to you. And I think you can get significantly mileage out of going back to work and starting to talk about, hey, are our incentive structures actually motivating the right behavior, or in the worst case, motivating exactly the wrong behavior? I have seen this work in environments other than Netflix. And that's what I would love to see you get from this presentation. I'd love you to actually think of this as a call to action to make your workplace better and sort of our work environment better. And for that, I want to leave you with one quote. In the 3rd century AD, Chinese soldiers were starting to invade Vietnam. and there was a 20-year-old Chinese peasant girl who decided that she was going to do something about it. So she started basically recruiting a bunch of men to join her militia army, and her brother tried to talk her out of it because, 20-year-old peasant girl. Her response is documented as, "I only want to ride the wind and walk the waves, slay the big whales of the eastern sea, clean up frontiers and save the people from drowning. Why should I imitate others, bow my head, stoop over, and be a slave?" And with that, we have a few minutes for questions.